now over in Blender, you want to make sure that you have your terrain selected. Another thing I should note that I did not notice in Blender 2.82, but I did in 2.83. So we have this file option here called half float precision. So use 16 bits per channel to lower the memory usage during rendering. I'm assuming that's if you were to use a 32-bit file, which we're only using 16 bits anyways. So I just have this selected. I didn't notice any conceivable difference between the two. Now what you're going to do is go over to the shading tab, make sure your terrain's selected, and you're going to want to create a material. I'm going to call this terrain. Very creative. Now there's two ways that you can do this. I'm going to do it the way that's the easiest. So what you want to do is start with two principled shaders. First one I'm going to set to black, second one I'm going to set to white. And you're going to want to put in a mix shader to mix between the two. Now for the factor, I'm going to put in an image texture. Can you guess which image it's going to be? If you guess the terrain alpha, you would be 100% correct. So it is not an sRGB color. You want it to set to non-color. It's just black and white. And let's preview this in Blender and see what we've got. Perfect. So you can see that you've got the peaks and the valleys. Black is rock, white is snow. And the nice thing about Houdini being procedural is you can always go back in Houdini and adjust the mask. But if you don't want to, if you're lazy, you'd always drop down a color ramp. Wait for that to calculate. And you can increase both values. You can adjust how you want them to be. You could also even lighten the values if it's too strong. It's completely up to you. So now I'm in Quixel Mixer and I'm just picking out my snow materials. So I'm actually going to pick, I think, 2 snow materials to start, and I'm going to blend between those two. So the first will be a fresh snow. You can see here. And the second will be a fresh windswept snow. So download settings that I use, it's 4K. You can of course use 2K if you're limited for bandwidth, or if you want to be insane, you can use 8K. And I use the offline metalness. Transmission, that might be useful. That might be useless, but we're going to take a look and see. So I'm going to download that. So one neat thing about Quixel Bridge is that you can actually export to Blender directly. So I have my blend file open. I am going to just click off of anything here, and I'm going to export to Blender at 4K with JPEG, which is the exact same download settings that I imported. So I'm just going to hit export. So now you can see in Blender that I have the fresh snow imported, and it's going to ironically freeze up my computer. Get it? Because it's snow. So you can see the material imported successfully. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab it, I'm going to cut it from that material and quickly paste the material in and plugged it into the mix shader. So I'm going to play with the scale value. Make sure you set the mapping to point. It was at texture, and I set it to around 64. So you see that gives me quite a bit of detail. Now you can tell that it is tiling, so what we're going to do is we're going to choose another material from Bridge. So I chose a nice windswept snow, so we can layer the windswept snow with the fresh snow. So I'm going to export that to Blender. So I imported that texture set into Blender here. So we're going to copy the mix shader, or copy between these two snows. Now what I did was I dropped down a color ramp, and I set the value to around 0.4 and the black to around 0.8, and then imported a noise texture, set the scale around 40, detail around 10, up the roughness and the distortion. Basically what that creates is a little bit of variation between the two. And because you have two different snows, that means it's not going to look like the textures repeat. Now this one up here I hit to 64, I hit this one 64 as well, set that to point. Now if you look at the two textures combined, you'll see there's basically no noticeable seams. It all looks very different. And maybe asking now, what about the rock? Well, for that, I have a good answer for you. Now the trick with rock and snow is not to use a straight rock, because I've done that before and that is a terrible mistake. It's very hard to blend between the two. So in this case I'm going to use a snow covered ground so I get the best of both worlds, because realistically it wouldn't be just have no snow on it, right? So now what I do here is I import in the rocky material, change this to point, and I set it to only around 32. I thought that 64 is just too high. So here's what it looks like on its own. And here's what it looks like with the material. So the rock might be fine on its own. So that's it on its own. And then this is just the snow. You can see that has a nice breakup. Then next, what I did to give the mountains a little bit more variation is I went to the color ramp for the terrain alpha, and I bumped down the black level, included a gray so that I can control just how much detail is exactly showing there. And what I did was I moved that into a mix RBG mode, and I turned that into overlay. And then what I had is a noise texture, 70 scale, 16 detail, no roughness or distortion, and I upped the white value just a bit, plump that into the bottom socket, and if you see there, that just kind of breaks up the detail. It kind of looks like wind almost breaking it up, and together that gives you this effect. So if you look here, this is before. Just give it one moment. Very straight and to the point, very boring. And then this here kind of breaks up the texture a bit for you. Now one thing I also did was added in a hue, saturation, and value node, because if you look at the material I selected here, you can see that there's a lot of green from grass, which is natural. However, I don't want it to be that green, so I bumped down the saturation to 0.3, which just gives it this look. Together, that is the mountain.